Our guest in this segment is Dr. Stephen A. Goldman. He's been a frequent guest on the program, and we are pleased to have him once again. Good morning, Doc. How are you, sir?
I'm good, and it's always great to be on.
Wonderful to have you. Let me ask you a question. What temperature do you set the heat at your house in the winter?
Between 71 and 72, because my wife and I vary as to our tolerance of cold.
Okay.
1 degree? You argue over 1 degree?
Well, we have two different HVACs.
Yes.
I would point out that David Letterman, I believe, used to keep his studio at 60 degrees.
Oh, Gilstrap would have loved that.
I would.
Yeah,
I would.
Yeah.
Not for me.
And I think there's a famous episode when the NBC suits came to see him. He served coffee that was ice cold.
Well, now it's very much in fashion, cold coffee, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So tell us about your day in Rockville and the marking of Maryland Emancipation Day and Veterans Day, sir.
Yeah, this is very exciting. I'll be speaking this Saturday, November 1st, starting at 10 o'clock in the morning at the historic red brick courthouse in downtown Rockville. And it's going to be demarking both the upcoming Veterans Day, but even more particular, Emancipation Day, which commemorates the unique event that took place during the Civil War when the state of Maryland itself abolished slavery in 1864, a year before the ratification of the 13th Amendment. And I'm very honored to be presenting the talk because it's yet again an example of the remarkable contradictory history of the great state of Maryland.
Yeah, let's get into that a little bit because there were obviously some key battles that were fought there as well. How does that all intertwine together, Dr. Goldman?
You know, that's a great point. Let me set the stage for what made Maryland so unique. First of all, it was a border slave state that stayed loyal to the Union. And of all the slave states, Maryland had, and this is really stunning when I tell people this, at the 1860 census, 49% of the African American population in the state of Maryland was free, which was the largest proportion of any slave or border state except for Delaware in terms of numbers of free people of color, and literally close to 84,000 African Americans were free in the state of Maryland, which is the highest number of any border state, which of course left 51% of black souls in Maryland, that is 87,000, were still enslaved. So it was almost an even split. That's number one. And not only that, of course, it remained in the Union. Secondly, as I think we've discussed before, the actual first bloodshed of the Civil War took place in downtown Baltimore at Fells Point when a Massachusetts regiment was attacked by the citizens of Baltimore when they were changing trains to arrive in the nation's capital, and they were attacked and there was a melee in the streets of Baltimore. That's the first bloodshed of the Civil War. And again, just a whole cascade of events that took place. The third aspect I would point out, and it's a great question you're asking, Rob, is of the states that fought in the Civil War, the only state in which regiments with the same designation from one state actually fought each other. And at the Battle of Front Royal in May 1862, the 1st Maryland Confederate States of America and the 1st Maryland Federal troops faced each other at Front Royal. That's the only state in which that happened. And then, of course, at Monocacy, the Battle of Monocacy, both the battle above Frederick 2 days before the actual battle at Monocacy Junction, you also had Maryland troops from the Confederacy facing Maryland troops from the Union, facing themselves on Maryland soil this time in pitched battle, which just exemplifies the status of Maryland as a border state.
You know, I know we've done several interviews on this, and we did a couple on the monocracy campaign. And I think this is the first time I'm hearing that. I don't recall hearing that before. I've just learned something new.
Well, I try and emphasize certain facts associated with it, and and I appreciate that, but this one really puts the context of what happened in 1864, because you had three things going on. And I'm going to mention him briefly this time. Lew Wallace was brought in to command the 8th Corps and the Middle Department, not because they anticipated that he was going to be leading a battle, much less one as important as monocracy. He was brought in March of 1864 by Lincoln to take over because they knew there was going to be an election in the state of Maryland to decide whether they're going to change the Constitution in Maryland and abolish slavery. That's the real reason why Lew Wallace was brought in. As it turned out, fortuitously, as we've discussed before, he performed brilliantly at the Battle of Monocacy. But the reason he was brought in was not that they expected there was going to be a battle there.
I'm confused. This is John. Good morning.
Sure.
We have been told for years that the Civil War was about the end of slavery. Maryland was a slave state. The Emancipation Proclamation was January 1, 1863. How did Maryland emancipation not happen until 1864?
All right. First of all, Maryland as a border state was not covered by the Emancipation Proclamation. The Emancipation Proclamation only covered states that were in rebellion against the United States. Border states were specifically not covered by that, John, because they were actively fighting for the Union. And politically, the concern was if they included the border states, whether or not that would have certain border states that refused to fight to save the Union.
So this is a point that I think needs to be emphasized when it comes down to nobody is an apologist for slavery, nor is anybody against the Emancipation Proclamation. But the deification of the Emancipation Proclamation and forgetting about the political aspects of the Emancipation Proclamation, that it did not in fact free slaves in the border states, or presumably where there were slaves somewhere in the northern states as well. I think most of the northern states had already emancipated their slaves before the Civil War started. But I just think it's an important point to raise that there were Union slaves that were not freed by Lincoln at the time that Lincoln freed the slaves in the country where he was not president.
All right, that's true, but bear in mind, the Emancipation Proclamation was more than simply a military measure, because by 1862, because the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation was proclaimed after the Battle of Antietam, there was so much agitation among Union soldiers against slavery. It reflected the fact that, yet again, men fighting a war were pushing something that they were seeing, because they were seeing slavery up close, and they were horrified by it. So it was not simply the actual measure itself. Even though technically they were not freed, they really were freed, John, because you had then the Second Militia Act, which enabled African Americans to serve in the armies of the Union. So that, technically you're correct, but it reflected a change, a vast change, in putting the Civil War on a different plane, which is what it did.
Good morning, Steve. Bill, thanks again for joining us. You provide a unique or different way to look at things, which is something I very much appreciate. You mentioned earlier Maryland being a border state, and the slaves, free slaves and slaves that's held in bondage were split basically down the middle. That would imply the legislative body in Maryland was pretty evenly split as well. By 1864, when Maryland passed the freedom of all slaves, had the legislative body shifted to more pro-union than had been before?
Okay, there's two things. And by the way, there was a process here because the legislature had to have a constitutional convention. So there was a process. There was a two-step process for it. The answer is yes. And by the way, let me burst two myths. For decades, people taught that the relative percentage of white Maryland citizens who fought in the Civil War, that it was equally between the Confederacy and the Union. That is absolutely wrong. It's generally considered, based on the best available information we have, that close to 3-1 white Marylanders fought for the Union, not for the Confederacy, which also shows, exactly answering your question, Bill, that this was a Union state. Secondly, you've got to remember that there were also free men of color who also fought for the Union from a border slave state. Again, quite remarkable, because you had, as I pointed out, 49% in the 1860 census, 49% of people of color in Maryland were free. Second-class citizens, let's be clear, but they were free, which enabled these men to go to war. And there were no, just again, because I anticipate John's question on this, there were no Maryland regiments that stayed Maryland regiments composed strictly of men of color. They all became members of the United States Colored Troop regiments. And as soon as they enlisted in 63, 64, they were sent to the USCT regiments in other states. But they did serve in great numbers, over 10,000 of them, also including the men who served in the Navy.
So in the immediate aftermath of Lincoln's assassination, John Wilkes Booth felt pretty comfortable wandering around through Maryland. Were the pockets of the Confederacy close into D.C. and into, I guess he went toward the Eastern Shore. That's where he was trying to go, right?
Yes, correct. All right, bear in mind, yet again, I do want to get to the election, to the process of how it took place. He got out of Maryland as quickly as he could. He tried to get into Virginia deliberately because politically, Maryland had already literally become the free state finally, and he wanted to get out of Maryland as quickly as he could for the reasons we're talking about. And yes, there were pockets, but the state was predominantly Union. And I do want to point out what happened in 1864, because, again, it was a two-step process. And one of the reasons why Lew Wallace was critical was that Lincoln and the Maryland legislature knew that whomever was in command of the middle department in Baltimore would have to administer the election. And the election had to be a fair election. Because don't forget, you have men serving in the Confederate armies. The question was whether they could vote, and of course the answer was no, even though that went to the state Supreme Court twice. Plus, you also had to make provisions for the voting of the men who were actively serving in the armies and navies of the Union. And what was just an astounding story is what happened with the actual vote. Would you like me to run through that?
Please do.
Yeah. This election was separate from the national election. So there were two elections in Maryland in 1864. There was the election to change the state constitution, then of course, and congressional. Then you had the congressional elections and national elections, which of course would be whether or not Lincoln would be reelected. When they totaled the vote, the civilian voters in Maryland voted down the new Constitution, meaning that the citizens not serving in the military of the state of Maryland who were eligible to vote voted against changing the Constitution. What swept the constitutional election by 9-1 was the soldiers' vote, which is exactly what happened in the national election when the soldiers' vote went disproportionately for Abraham Lincoln.
I do recall you bringing that up in a previous discussion, yes. Why do you think
Right.
that was the case?
I can give you the exact figures. That there was the difference between, by the way, of yes or no to abolish slavery in Maryland was 375 votes total. And the soldiers' vote was 2,633 to 263 in favor of abolishing slavery.
In favor of abolishing slavery, is that the same as voting for Abraham Lincoln?
Well, it correlated with it because, again, Lincoln was advocating. Don't forget the platform for the National Party, the Lincoln's Party, was that the 13th Amendment would be not just ratified but also endorsed, enacted, and then ratified. Because, again, what all three of you were asking before, the Emancipation Proclamation was a military measure. It was not going to withstand the end of the war. There had to be a constitutional amendment. Exactly what happened in Maryland. Maryland was a microcosm of the national election. But the fact that a border slave states, white soldiers, while the war was going on, disproportionately voted to abolish slavery tells you exactly what I've been saying so many times we've talked before, the radicalization process that takes place during war. And these men embodied that.
Steve, did any other states precede the 13th Amendment by abolishing slavery besides Maryland?
No, Maryland was the only one. By the way, you might find this interesting. There were still slaves legally in the state of New Jersey before the Civil War.
It's interesting.
Because their laws had enabled some people to be forced to remain in slavery up to a certain time period. Whereas other places like Massachusetts abolished slavery in the late 1700s. But no, the answer, Bill, is no. Maryland was the only state that did that.
It's interesting you mentioned that the Confederate soldiers were not allowed to vote, which means that the government knew who the Confederate soldiers were. So that brings up the question of what happened to the property and families of the Confederate soldiers that were in Union territory. They're at that point they're traitors or terrorists or whatever would be the right term at the time.
It wasn't seized. Again, they were not under Reconstruction, as you recall, even though there was a Freedmen's Bureau in Maryland after the war. But there were literally, I think, 15 sections that the state legislature passed as to what you had to attest to be able to vote, because that came up as an issue. So obviously, men serving in the armies and navies of the Confederacy could not vote on this issue because they were in active rebellion against the United States government. Their families could vote, but the men in active insurrection against the federal government could not vote. That's why you had to literally swear these different loyalty statements to be able to vote.
Steve, as a variant to John's question, you mentioned property of Confederate soldiers was not seized. However, any damage done during war, the Confederates would not, or Confederate sympathizers would not be reimbursed for damage. Is that not correct?
Yeah, but neither were loyal Union citizens either.
I thought they were at Antietam. I thought the Union's residents were reimbursed fairly quickly, whereas the sympathizers were never reimbursed.
That really isn't true. I mean, there's a whole, which again, it's like a separate issue. There's a whole discussion in many of the books about who actually got paid for the damage during the war. And it varied tremendously from battle to battle, state to state. There were people, both North and South, who received nothing or got less value than they anticipated. Don't forget, people were confiscating horses and other things. But there were disputes about this, for decades after the war as to whether or not people were actually reimbursed for damage.
Dr. Stephen A. Goldman has been our guest here on the program. And on November the 1st, you'll be speaking in Rockville about this very topic. How do people get tickets to your speech that particular day, or what is the place they show up to?
Okay, it's free. People can register through the Peerless Rockville website. And just literally click on the registration. They can also come to my website, StephenAGoldmanMD.com or Peerless Rockville, and just show up. It's free, and it'll be great to see folks.
We've only got 2 minutes left. This question probably is broader than that, but it does come up in my mind as we discuss this. Maryland and Virginia are border states. They basically share the District of Columbia in terms of forming it and having it become the nation's capital. But they're so different. They share the bay. They have an ocean that they share. Why such difference between the two states?
That's a great question. And one of the most important things is the proximity of Maryland to the border of Pennsylvania. That's free territory. And you also had a very active free African-American population, particularly in Frederick County, and also Boulder. Don't forget, the most famous African-American in the United States from mid-19th century on was Frederick Douglass, who was from Maryland. He walked off his job as a caulker in Baltimore to flee to New York City, and that's how he emancipated himself. So I think that's an aspect of it. Like Cumberland is like 3 or 4 miles from the Pennsylvania border. That makes a tremendous difference because that was freedom.
Good answer.
And there were other aspects of it, but the free African American population, the fact that so many people were already free already, and as Bill, you asked, the changing government in the state of Maryland in terms of support of staying a member of the union. That was the critical aspect that led to all the things that we're talking about.
Dr. Stephen A. Goldman, good stuff as always. Great appearance, sir.
My pleasure, and I look forward to speaking with you on Veterans Day.
It will be, a couple weeks away here.
Thanks, Steve.
Thank you.
My pleasure as always.